think this is a sizable group. So I guess we can get started here. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for our second webinar, our lead webinar session. This webinar series is brought to you by the Richmond City Health District and Virginia Poverty Law Center through a grant through the National Center for Healthy Housing. The purpose of these webinars is to expand awareness of the dangers of lead hazard in homes across the Commonwealth and to build a coalition of support to develop local and state ordinances to require lead inspection and rental units. Last week, we had a great panel that discussed, gave a general overview of the dangers of lead in homes and the intersection of health and housing. So before we begin, we would love to know a little bit about you. So please take a moment to answer this brief poll to let us know how you found out about this webinar and the sector you represent. Also feel free to introduce yourself and your organization in the chat as well. So if you could take a few moments and just fill out this poll for us, this will allow our panelists to kind of get an idea of what sectors you're coming from. And we would love to know how you found out about this webinar. Great. Hey there, Levi from Harrisonburg, Cherry from Roanoke. Great to see Sir Cap still here with us. How are we looking on that poll, Flora?
We have about 60% of people who have responded.
Okay. Well, I'll just keep on talking. It's great to know where you guys are coming from. But today we have a packed panel of professionals who are working in our communities to address lead hazard in homes. We have Scott Slagley, environmental health specialist and licensed lead risk assessor with the Richmond City Health District. Dwayne Roadcap, director of the Office of Drinking Water. Tricia Henshaw, executive director of the Board for Asbestos, Lead, and Home Inspectors with the Department of Professional and Occupational Regulation. Katie Kennedy, program manager for Lead Safe Roanoke, and Zach Miller, manager of Housing Innovation with Project Homes. So they will be able to answer some of your questions after everyone has presented. So please feel free to utilize the Q&A function down at the Zoom, this Zoom function here. And please use that to enter your questions as they pop up throughout the panel. And we'll have some time afterwards to answer some of these questions. So please remember that this is the second of 4 webinar sessions. Next week, we will talk about the legal landscape of lead hazard control. And then in our final session, we'll talk about national best practices. So please remember to register for each session, excuse me. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Scott. Just let me give control to him and we can get started.
Here we go. All right, thanks, Eric. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining this second webinar. As Eric said, I'm Scott Slagley. I'm with the Richmond City Health District. And in my job, on a frequent basis, I do lead risk assessments and healthy homes work. So today I'm going to talk about what we do when we do a lead risk assessment in the city of Richmond. So a couple of definitions. This is the boring stuff to get off to start with. A lead risk assessment is an on-site investigation to determine the existence, nature, severity, and location of lead-based paint hazards in a residential dwelling or child-occupied facility. A lead lead-based paint hazard is any condition that causes exposure to lead from lead-contaminated dust, soil, or paint that is deteriorated or on accessible surfaces, friction surfaces, or impact surfaces that would result in an adverse human health effect. I didn't mention, you'll notice I didn't mention water in that, because when we do lead risk assessments, we do sampling of water, but it's not part of the required protocol. In Richmond, they use a corrosion control agent in the water and to prevent lead from leaching out of pipes and fixtures. And it's interesting when we contact an owner or a rental occupant to do a risk assessment, it's almost always the first thing they ask about is, are you going to sample the water or test the water? And we do that, but it's almost never the water is where we find a lead hazard. In the city of Richmond, city code gives the health department some authority. It talks about, and it's a little different than the federal regulations. So in Richmond, we do lead risk assessments for children age 6 and under. The federal regulation is under the age of 6. An elevated blood lead level per our code is greater or equal to 10 micrograms per deciliter, which is more than the CDC blood lead reference level. And of course, we'll do a home of a pregnant woman. Then the health department will go out, do a lead risk assessment. We can issue a notice of violation. Most municipalities do not have that authority. And once the issue is abated, we will re-inspect the dwelling and make sure all the work has been done correctly. So what we do for a lead risk assessment is we get background on the property, especially the owner. We do a visual inspection to locate deteriorated paint or other hazards. We test the deteriorated painted surfaces. We use an XRF. A lot of municipalities do not have that. We also sample and do laboratory analysis of dust and bare soil. We only do bare soil because if it's got grass or mulch, that cuts off a route of exposure. We also do other things if we see them in a home, other than sampling of drinking water. They may have personal items that we can test with our XRF. And then of course we give them our mega report that everybody goes, I can't believe how long that report is. So the picture here is of an XRF machine, and that's what we use. Some risk assessors only have the ability to take paint chip analysis or things like that. But this slide is about lead-based paint inspection, and that's different than a risk assessment. In a lead-based paint inspection, you test all painted surfaces to determine whether there's lead-based paint or not. You don't sample for dust and soil, and again, water wouldn't be included. Most of the investigations we do are a combination of lead-based paint inspections and risk assessment. Once you go through the risk assessment and you identify the lead hazards, we try to educate homeowners or rental unit occupants, things they can do on their own to mitigate lead exposure. Things like control dust by putting mats at the doorways, avoid locations with lead-based paint, be it porches, windowsills, bare soil in the yard. Do some additional cleaning. If they're doing DIY projects, to follow lead-safe work practices, and wash their work clothes away from their kids' clothes, and do interim controls for an owner, which would be paint stabilization or repainting. lead-based paint abatement is different, and I think Zach's going to talk about that, so I won't even talk about that. And then we also talk about lifestyle modification, things like if they use spices or cookware from other countries. This is especially prevalent in the refugee and immigrant community. Spices, cosmetics, ceremonial powders, if they're from other countries, cookware made in other countries. We try to educate them on putting those aside and using things they might have bought locally. Factors to consider: a lead-based paint inspection. It's going to take longer because you're trying to get to every painted surface in the house. Accessibility can be an issue. People tend to have a lot of stuff, and sometimes it's hard to get to the walls and the baseboards and all the windows. It can be cost prohibitive if you don't have the right equipment, like an XRF. A lead risk assessment takes less time. You only have to look at the deteriorated painted surfaces. You also look at other sources like dust, soil, and of course we do water. But sometimes occupants may not want to talk about their personal lives or their personal habits. We think you could probably do a quick, all this is about talking about getting inspection of rental units. We think you could get a minimum cost for a hybrid investigation could be on the $700 range, because money is going to play a factor in everything when you start talking about rental registries and inspections. This is a map of cases in Richmond from 2014 to 2019, and it doesn't show up very good, but by and large, most of the, about 78% of the properties were rental units in single-family dwellings or multifamily units of no more unit than 4 per lot. African Americans are impacted almost 3 times more than white citizens. Each of the dots on here is, if it's a larger dot, that means there are multiple cases within a small range area. So if you compare that, and we couldn't overlay this, which I apologize, but this is, most of the investigations we do are in zoning areas R4, 5, and 6. This is those areas in the city of Richmond. And if you toggle back and forth, you can sort of see where the cases end up. They're not in the large apartment complexes and things like that. They're in single family homes and duplexes by and large. All right, in Richmond, we sort of have a tale of two cities, because on the north side, if you look at photo 1, that's the typical type of house we look at. On the south, it's a 2-story, 4-square house, 4-bedroom, often with a basement. On the south side, it's a single story. Usually it's been there a while, and there's an addition or 2 added onto it. Here's some in the trenches photos. I know they're stunningly interesting, but this is what we see on every job we go to almost. Friction points, friction surfaces at the doors, window sills, things like that. Especially the front door, where everybody goes in and out. Other places we find deteriorated lead-based paint, baseboards, stairway stringers. The front and back porches are always an issue. And usually not foundations, but the foundation windows. That's all I have to say. But when I was putting this together, I'm always looking for slides, and I found a couple of old advertisements. And it's interesting, this is how far we've come. The one on the right shows a little boy in a sailor suit with a bucket of white lead paint, licking it like a popsicle. And back in the day, when you wanted your paint, you went to the hardware store. You didn't have the big box. They sold you white lead paste, and they sold you gallons of linseed oil, and you'd mix it yourself. So you had death in two cans, so to speak. I appreciate your time, and I'll answer any questions.
Yeah, we'll get to the questions during our Q&A portion.
Okay.
Definitely put those questions in the chat. Dwayne will, Scott will be able to answer those towards the end, and we'll pass it on over to Dwayne here. Hold on, let me give you control of the screen here. And I'll let Dwayne take over.
Hi, everybody. This is Dwayne Roadcap with the Office of Drinking Water, Virginia Department of Health. I work with a group of about 120 people in the Office of Drinking Water, and we cover all types of systems. So we regulate around 2,830 public water systems in Virginia, and they range from very large systems that you find in the city of Richmond or Newport News, Virginia Beach, Fairfax, very small systems that are in small counties that might be just for a single restaurant, a daycare, or an adult care home. So 25 people, 60 days out of the year is generally the threshold on what we regulate. And so this is a federally based program, so these are not rules that apply to just Virginia, but these would be all rules that apply to the states in the continental US as well as the territories. I'm going to try and move the screen, Eric.
Yeah, if you try clicking, and then I think you'll have control then.
All right. Have I got it now?
Yeah, you should be able to arrow through.
All right. I'm hitting the button, but it's not working for me, Eric.
Let's see. How about I do it for you? You can just tell me
All
when
right.
to go next.
All right, we'll work it that way. Sorry about that.
No, it's fine.
So for this presentation, what I was going to try and do is focus on two aspects of the drinking water program. One is dealing with how we monitor lead in drinking water and who that applies to, and then talk about a lead service line replacement program that we have with one of our divisions. And I'd like to thank Bob Edelman, who's our Director of Technical Services, and May Fianori, hope I said your name correctly, May. They're both on the presentation today, and they helped put this together, and I want to give them credit because they're the people who actually working these programs and make it happen. So you can go ahead and slide to the next, Eric. When we talk about the lead and copper rule, this is a federally based rule. It's from 1991, and the EPA is getting ready to do revisions to this. So I'm going to talk about what the current rules are, and then just give you a brief outline of what the future rules will look like probably in a few months. The EPA, we're expecting to come out with a final rule on a replacement requirement. So this has been around for a long time, and there's two aspects to it. So as we know, lead is harmful, and it can cause a lot of problems with your health. And so there is a contaminant level goal, a maximum contaminant level goal of 0. We don't want to have lead in our drinking water. And generally, lead is not naturally found in water. So the lead generally comes from lead pipes, faucets, and fixtures, which dissolve lead into the water. And lead can sometimes enter as flakes or small particles into the water supply as well from the distribution system. To keep lead from entering the water, we require some systems, including those that have difficulty controlling lead, to treat water using certain chemicals that keep the lead in place by reducing corrosion. And this treatment is called corrosion control. So when corrosion control alone is not sufficient to control lead exposure, we require systems to educate the public about the risks of lead in drinking water and to replace lead service lines. What you see here is that there's also an expectation on health for copper, but I'm going to focus primarily on lead. If you go to the revised rules, the action level that you see there of 15 parts per billion, what that is that tells us whether corrosion control is working. And what we're trying to do is assess, is there a risk of lead in the water, and is the corrosion control working? And so we do sampling at taps, and then what we will look for is that if more than 10% of the taps exceed that action level, then some additional actions are required by the water purveyor. In the future rule, they're trying to move that action level from 15 parts per billion down to 10 parts per billion. And the other things that are going to look different, we think, in the revised rule from now is that there will be, depending on how far you are above the trigger level, the 10 parts per billion in the future, systems would be required to do lead service line replacement actions. And the future rule would also require sampling at schools that currently doesn't happen with the premise plumbing. And so there's a fair number of improvements that are coming forward, but right now we're just talking about what the current rule is. And Eric, you can change the slide. All right, so when we're talking about sampling, what we're trying to do is we're sampling hopefully from the places that we would expect to find lead. So we water purveyors, whoever our regulant is, they come to us with a sampling plan, and then we have engineers and environmental staff who review those plans, and we're trying to make sure that we're looking where we think the lead could be found. So Virginia's been here for quite a while with populations, and so we have a lot of lead service lines, a lot of lead in premise plumbing, and so we're looking for those places when we're sampling, because again, we're trying to figure out, is our corrosion control working? And so we have different categories, but primarily we're looking at single family residences, and we're looking for lead service lines or premise plumbing, plumbing inside the house that might contain lead, so that we can assess the corrosion control. You can go to the next slide, Eric. And what happens is as we're monitoring those homes with the sampling plan and confirming that we're getting the highest risk samples, what you see here are three different categories. You know, the no exceedance, you just keep monitoring, but if there is a lead exceedance, then we're looking at trying to update the corrosion control, change it. We're looking at the source water. Are there things with the source water that we need to replace or change? We're looking at public education, and we will also talk about replacing lead service lines if we can. You can go to the next slide, Eric. So that's how we monitor. And then the next question is the other part of our program that we have is about replacing lead service lines. And so this is a diagram of what you might expect to see with a lead service line. There's a public side that the regulated community that we regulate houses. So that's the water purveyor side, the public water system side of it. And then there's a private side that's attached to the homeowner. And so there's usually a meter box, usually at the curb, and that's where the bifurcation happens, where you go from where the public water system regulates versus what the homeowner is responsible for. And so then that line from the city street into the internal plumbing, which we call premise plumbing, and that usually is from to that water meter or shut-off valve in the house. So the question is what will we pay for under our lead service line program? So we do have a program where we will help reimburse costs for replacing lead service lines. And so Eric, if you'd go to the next slide for me. We have, what I'm trying to show here is where we might have a lead service line and a lead-free service line, and what will we pay for or not pay for with these three choices here. And Eric, if you would click the slide again. So in the first case where we would replace replacement is there, and we can help pay for that lead service line replacement. You can go ahead and click again, Eric. In the second case, we would cover that. Again, we would do the partial replacement on the private owner side and be able to reimburse for that. And in the last case, where there's only a partial replacement on one side, we would not allow that. And the reason that we would not allow that is that there's some studies out there that show that if you only do a partial replacement on one side, then the agitation and the construction of that new service line can actually make the lead concentration worse and cause greater problems if you don't replace the whole thing. And so the one thing that this doesn't show is that we do not cover premise plumbing. So we will replace the lead service line to where that meter box is inside the house, perhaps from the street to where the water shutoff valve is inside the house. And you can go to the next slide, Eric. So when we're trying to choose who can take part of our program, generally what we're trying to look at is where have we seen action level exceedances in the Commonwealth, and where have we seen blood level cases, and where can we get the most bang for our buck, where we would have a higher population that can be part of the program. So the way this program works is that we we set up a program that our regulated community will have. And so we've got a few places in Virginia: Alexandria, Henry County, Richmond, and Chesapeake. And each one of those locations would choose the kind of how they would want to set up the program. And they would run the program. They would take the applications for lead service line replacements. We provide the money and the oversight and make sure that we're only paying for things that we can pay for through the federal grant. And so to date, we've awarded $3.7 million roughly to 8 projects in those 4 localities: Alexandria, Henry County, Richmond, and Chesapeake. And we've also set up the application process so that you can, so that we're comparing like to like kinds of situations. So we have a limited amount of funding for this type of work. And so we want to make sure that we're comparing similar requests against similar requests. We're not comparing a lead service line replacement request against I want to do some other type of construction or infrastructure upgrade. So we're going to try and compare like to like going forward. And so you can see those little yellow stars on the map, and that's where those localities are that I was just talking about: Alexandria, Henry County, Richmond, and Chesapeake, for the $3.7 million that we've allowed for. And generally, we will pay for up to $2,500 for a lead service line replacement on the homeowner side. And you can go to the last slide there, Eric. So lastly, what we're trying to do is we're trying to improve our marketing for this program, trying to get more communities involved in it and applying. And that's where you get this lead elimination assistance program. And we believe that there's a big opportunity for us in Virginia to make better use of this program in more localities, because there are a lot of lead service lines in Virginia. And so we're pumping out some flyers and infographics. We've updated our website, and we've made some good progress with trying to get the message out. And with that, Eric, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you for changing the slides for me.
No problem. Thank you, Dwayne. Next up, we'll have Trisha. Hopefully I can get this going.
Here we go. Thank you, Eric. My name is Trisha Henshaw. I work for the Department of Professional and Occupational Regulation. I'm an executive director, and one of the boards I work with is the Virginia Board for Asbestos, Lead, and Home Inspectors. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about what we do in terms of licensing and making sure that the people who you bring on to help you with your lead abatement projects have the proper licenses and are competent to do so. Let's see. There we go. So DPOR, what we do, we oversee 18 regulatory boards and programs. We are a state agency under the Secretary of Commerce and Trade, and so our focus is on helping businesses in Virginia, but also protecting the public through making sure that there are minimum competency for professions that the General Assembly has deemed need to be regulated. We do that through our boards. Our boards are comprised of people in the industries and citizens. And so the board that I work with, there are some lead professionals on the board as well as asbestos and home inspectors, but we have training providers, we have 2 citizen members. And so it's meant to be kind of a microcosm of people who would be most knowledgeable of the particular professions that we're regulating. Overall, DPOR regulates about 300,000 individuals and businesses. And so we have everything from architects to contractors. We even have professional wrestlers, tattooists, real estate professionals, tradesmen, and various other professions that are considered non-medical. And so specifically, you're going to hear me talk a lot about the board, and the board does this and the board regulates that. That's because the authority to license lead abatement professionals and to enforce its regulations, which could be through disciplinary actions if things go wrong, and we'll talk about that a little bit, is invested with the board. So I work with the board. I don't work for the board, but I am responsible for carrying out the activities that they authorize through its regulations and other actions. And so when we talk about lead licensing, what we're looking at is any of those individuals and businesses that are performing lead abatement. I know Scott talked a little bit about abatement and interim controls, and that's something we look very closely at when we're looking at whether or not someone needs to have a lead license. We're looking at you're abating the lead, so permanent removal from the premises is what we're looking at. To see what kind of license you need to have and whether or not you need to have one under the lead program. There are some other certifications and things that you would need to have. So like if you're in target housing and child occupied facilities that are pre-1978 and you're doing some renovations and repairs, those folks do need to have some certifications through EPA. So while I'm not covering those today because they don't fall under the board, there may be some other things that would impact depending on the type of project that you are looking at having done. When you're looking at what type of things the board has done to establish competency levels, a lot of it we follow the EPA. EPA kind of sets out the model regulations and requirements, and so we as the Commonwealth have decided to follow those requirements, but it's administered on the state level. And so all of our applicants are going to have to take some type of board approved training program. So everyone has a training program before they can be considered for licensure. They also have to do refresher training when they are licensed. So it's not just get trained once and then don't come back. Then you also have many licenses, depending on the types, might have to have higher education and experience that they have to document. Supervisors, risk assessors, and inspectors also have to take a state approved exam. And so that exam includes technical questions, so about the actual performing the work, but then also questions about laws and regulations that impact those doing abatements and what they need to know when they're doing those abatements in your home. The other thing that, backing up a little bit, the difference license types that we have under the lead abatement program, you see listed there along with the regulant population. And so those are the numbers as of August 1st of how many people in each category have a license with us. So you have the workers, supervisors, inspectors, risk assessors, which Scott gave a lot of good information about, project designers, and contractors. So when you look at all of that they have to do, and we're going to talk about all the different licenses that are often involved, it's a lot of an undertaking to get licensed to do this type of work. In addition to licensing these individuals and businesses, the board also accredits the training providers. So where I mentioned earlier, they have to take initial training and refresher training. They also need to have that training approved by the board, and we actually will go in and audit those training providers to make sure they are following the regulations, teaching what they need to teach, all of those different things to make sure that they are making our workforce competent to do the work that they're doing. So this is where it gets all regulatory and complicated. So I'm going to keep it very high level because, you know, unless you're a regulatory person, this will put you to sleep in just a minute or two. There are different licenses that you have to have if you're doing lead abatement. And it's unfortunately, to make it more confusing, it's done through 2 different boards. So in addition to having to have a contractor's license through the ALHI board, which is the Asbestos, Lead and Home Inspectors Board, excuse me, you'll see that top item, you actually also have to have a contractor's license with the LAC specialty, which is lead abatement contractor, that's issued by the Board for Contractors. Well, it makes sense if you're a regulatory nerd and you look at laws and regs all day, why there are 2 different ones, but I understand it doesn't make sense if you're, you know, someone who doesn't have to do that for a living. And so the reason is when you are entering into any kind of contract to do any kind of work on commercial or residential property, you have to have a contractor's license if that contract is over $1,000. So that's really looking at the contract part, the money part. The lead contractor's license issued by the ALHI board is looking at the work part. Do you have the supervisors and the workers and the licensed people doing what they're supposed to do? So we're looking at the actual performance of the work. In addition, that lead contractor also has to have lead supervisors overseeing the work. So each project needs to have a lead supervisor that's overseeing the work, and they also have to submit the name of a supervisor along with their contractor's license, so that we have that person on file as to who is actually responsible for the work as a qualified individual. And then finally, anyone who's actually performing the work under that supervisor also has to have a lead worker license. So that's also issued by the ALHI board, and those folks have to go through training initially and then every 3 years to keep that license current. So I'm not going to get into all of that, and fortunately Eric said these will be available later, so if you need to see a quick outline of who does what, this will be here for you. The lead inspector is the one who is going to collect the samples to determine whether or not lead is present, and Scott did a great job explaining that, so I'm not going to go into all of that in great detail, but they're also the person who can perform the post-abatement clearance procedures. And so what that means is after you've had the abatement done, obviously you want to know that, you know, that abatement has eliminated the lead hazard, and so that final test is done by the lead inspector. You also have a project designer who may be involved to prepare a final abatement report. They also may do some occupant protection plans prior to the abatement. Then you have the lead risk assessor. Again, won't get into all of that, but they also can perform post-abatement clearance procedures and do the written assessment. And I would refer you to Scott's presentation where he went over that so well. So the part I've talked about so far is the board's authority in terms of issuing licenses and determining what the competency level is and all of that. Well, once someone has their license, the board also is responsible for disciplinary action if there were to be a regulatory violation. And so this heading says penalties for unlicensed practice. It should say and disciplinary action, since that's a little bit of a misnomer. So that first bullet there where it talks about if the contractor and supervisor are licensed, and so say they were employing workers who weren't licensed, or they weren't following laws and regs related to the abatement, and so you as the person who's working with them have decided to submit a complaint, we look at it and see that, yes, this could potentially be a regulatory violation. There are certain sanctions that the board can provide for. And so you'll see there could be up to a $2,500 monetary penalty per count. So if you're talking something that has multiple counts, that could get a little bit pricey. The board also has the authority to suspend a license. So it could be that they're going to require the employees of the company to go to some kind of remedial education because it was thought by the board to be more of a situation where they didn't know a requirement that they should know. They may suspend the license for a temporary period of time, 30, 60 days, however they want, until that requirement is met. In licensing land, the death penalty is revocation. that means that license is gone. You cannot work after that day. It is done. That doesn't mean that that person or company can't reapply and come before the board and show that they've learned whatever lesson it is they needed to learn. But that license that is revoked by the board is never to be again. We look at situations with unlicensed activity a little differently because they aren't a licensee of the board. The board does not have authority over them. However, it is a criminal violation to engage in unlicensed activity. So what does that mean? First and second offenses could be a class 1 misdemeanor. If you get 3 or more offenses in 36 months, you can be convicted of a class 6 felony. For our boards in DPOR, it can be challenging because we will investigate an unlicensed case. We'll get all the information together, but then we turn it over to the local Commonwealth's attorney. And of course, depending on priorities, you know, it may or may not go forward. But I will also say that there are people who have been and are in jail for unlicensed practice in our various professions. So it can really happen. It's kind of like, do you want to be the one going the fastest on the interstate and take the chance? You know, you can do that, but then there can be consequences for that. And also the court could also order that person who's engaging in unlicensed activity to pay restitution. There are exemptions in the law. If you're doing lead-based paint activities on your own property and you occupy that residence, then there is an exemption from licensure for that. Going through all of that, this is the information if you ever wanted to file a complaint. You will need to include documentation. You can't do it anonymously. I know sometimes that's difficult. We'll look at it to determine if there's probable cause, and if so, we will forward it through the process for potential disciplinary action. There is an entire due process thing that we do, and we always think it's important to let, especially homeowners and people like that who've been harmed by a licensee. The board cannot make restitution or make that licensee repair or make you whole again. Our authority is limited to the licensee and being able to take action against the licensee. Last thing, just for your information, these are some additional resources. You've got EPA, Department of Health, Dwayne talked a little bit earlier, Department of Housing and Community Development. I know they have some grant programs to help with some of the lead hazards. Labor and Industry, they are responsible for permitting a lead abatement project and worker safety and all of that type of thing. And then also localities, which I think we'll hear a little bit more about that as well, in addition to City of Richmond earlier. And if you have any questions that you don't think of here, or follow-up questions, or want to know if someone licensed, any of those things, you have my direct information there, but also information for both the ALHI board as well as the board for contractors. And so thank you all so very much for your time, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Tricia. Oh, sorry. And next up is Katie. Sorry, your title got cut off here.
It's okay.
I guess if you could introduce yourself again and let us know. And I think you're in control now.
Good afternoon. I'm Katie Kennedy. I'm the program manager with Lead Safe Roanoke. We're based in the city of Roanoke and are funded through HUD's Office of Lead Hazard Control and Healthy Homes. There we go. At Lead Safe Roanoke, our mission is to prevent childhood lead poisoning. Children are most frequently poisoned by ingesting lead-based paint. If you've ever watched a young child play, you know they'll put anything they find in their mouth. And so that's a big concern for us. Something you might not know is lead-based paint actually tastes sweet. And I think the first image of children, and when you think of children and lead-based paint, is kids chewing on windowsills. And so while that is a concern because we don't want them ingesting the lead that might be painted on the windowsills, our really big concern is the lead dust that you may not even see from deteriorated lead-based paint. We frequently get that from windows that are painted with lead-based paint. You're creating a friction when you're opening and closing them every time. When you're closing an impact surface, when you're closing a door, walking along a painted porch floor, all of that is disturbing the lead, and it's going to create kind of a coating of lead dust where the kid is playing. And so what they may be doing is they're playing and getting that dust on their hands, on their toys, and then they're putting those in their mouth and ingesting the lead paint. That can also happen when they're inside or when they're outside if they're playing bare soil and if their toys are outside. And so that's lead-based paint is the biggest way we see lead poisoning in children. There's no safe level of lead for exposure in children. And we're most concerned about children who are under the age of 6 as their bodies are growing rapidly and they're absorbing everything that they take in, including the bad stuff like lead. Adults don't absorb lead quite as fast as young children do, and the younger the child, the more at risk they are of lead poisoning. So for almost 15 years, Lead Safe Roanoke has provided lead hazard services in the city of Roanoke. Currently, we're averaging about a home per week, and to date have completed over 400 homes since we've started. The photo you see on the screen is one of the homes that we provided lead hazard reduction work to. But we also provide outreach and education to our community, letting them know about the program as well as the dangers of lead. We do skills training. We offer and pay for community members to get their lead abatement worker courses taken, as well as their supervisors. And then we also do renovate, repair, and painting, also known as RRP for community members that you may think of like as a maintenance staff or somebody who's doing DIY to give themselves safe practices while working in a home built pre-1978, which is when lead-based paint was banned. Today, however, I'm going to focus on our education and outreach, our partnership with code enforcement and our local landlords, as Zach is going to tell you a little bit more about the inspections and lead hazard reduction services that they do in Richmond. So how much lead is too dangerous? Our ultimate goal when providing education and outreach services is for the community to understand the dangers of lead-based paint and how little it takes to make a child sick. Think about opening a sugar packet and sprinkling it. The amount of sugar in that, if you put lead dust in that size sugar packet, it could contaminate 100 10 by 10 rooms. Again, a reminder, there's no safe level of lead exposure for children, so just that tiny amount can contaminate that entire 100 rooms. Think about what that could do in one home. We also want to help families and homeowners understand what lead paint might look like and be on the lookout for in their own homes. So if you see paint in your home that starts to look like an alligator, there's a high likelihood that it's lead-based paint. Lead Safe uses a risk assessor with an XRF machine to test for lead, but you can also get an EPA certified lead check kit at home improvement stores like Lowe's to check your own home. However, if your home is built pre-1978, it's best just to assume that it's lead-based paint and follow RRP guidelines when you're doing any work on your own home. Or having a contractor do it, you can look up whether or not they're certified in RRP, whether or not they're doing lead abatement work or not, they should be certified in RRP, and you can look that up on the EPA's website. The picture that I show you is one of our outreach tools, but that's actually a picture that the background is something that I took at my own home. I took the RRP certified class and followed RRP guidelines, and that's a door and an exterior door in my home that I made lead safe by following RRP guidelines. Lead testing and remediation can be really expensive and very time consuming. So you may be wondering what you can do to help protect your family now. We recommend doing a wet clean. So doing mopping, using spray cleaners when you're cleaning out windowsills as opposed to a vacuum, which the dry clean can send the lead dust up into the air and then you're gonna inhale it. Taking off your shoes when you go inside. That way you're not tracking lead dust, especially if you maybe potentially have a job where you are around lead, especially with potentially a construction worker or contractor. Eating foods rich in iron, calcium, and vitamin C can help combat the absorption of lead. And of course, I think everybody's doing this already, but washing your hands frequently and making sure your children are washing their hands frequently. So we get our message out in a lot of different ways and are currently evolving to provide virtual outreach and trainings. One of our favorite activities to do is Dusty the dog. Dusty's visited local schools and child care centers to show children how, even though they can't see the lead dust, it might still be on their hands. They pet Dusty and then they put their hands in our little viewing box and can look down and see their hands are illuminated with the dust, the pretend dust that's on there. They learn about how even though they can't see it, it's still there, and then practice washing their hands. Afterwards, they get a coloring book from one of our other favorite characters, Derek the dinosaur, to take home and share with their families so they can share with their families how to be lead safe in their home and also help families who may be qualified for our program to contact us. Our outreach coordinator will literally dress up in anything and go anywhere. We take any opportunity we can to educate the community on the dangers of lead. We present at parenting classes to provide education and help enroll families into our program. We partnered with our local food bank to provide free fruits and vegetables, while at the same giving education on how their diet can help prevent lead poisoning. And in the spring, we actually had the Lead Safe Leprechaun make a special appearance on our Facebook page to talk about lead safe cleaning practices. One of our strongest partnerships is with our city's code enforcement. They're knowledgeable in the dangers of lead, and they do rental inspections in Roanoke's rental districts. They'll provide education to tenants as well as landlord about the dangers of lead. Now, they'll also cite people if they see chipping and peeling paint. If they see chipping and peeling paint, and they know that there's a kid in the home or a kid frequently visiting and they think the family would qualify for our program, they'll refer them to us along with a citation. And actually over 70% of the homes that have been referred to us with our partnership with code enforcement have participated in the program and eliminated the lead hazards in their homes. You can see this house right here is one that we actually just finished doing a couple months ago. This was the condition when it had the rental inspection, and our code enforcement officer let us know about the house as well as giving the landlord a citation for the chipping and peeling paint. But because of the partnership, we were able to work together. The tenant and the landlord agreed to participate in the program, and we remediated all the lead hazards from the home at very little cost to the landlord. So these are the before pictures, but this house received full lead hazard control and was completely, did a wet scrape and completely repainted on the outside. So there's no longer any chipping or peeling paint. And it created a much healthier home for the current resident as well as future residents. Under Title 10, if you're a landlord, you must give an EPA approved Protect Your Family from Lead in Your Home pamphlet and disclose any known information about lead inspections you may have done, or if the home is built pre-1978, that there might be the possibility of lead in the rental unit. You can include a document similar to the one up here, just acknowledging that the unit was built pre-1978 and may contain lead, or if you know of it, and telling that, giving the records along with this document and noting that you provided with the pamphlet. You can sign this and include it as part of your lease. A landlord who fails to comply with these regulations can face thousands of dollars in fines. And additionally, if the family or the tenant that's living there, they may have to pay up to 3 times of the injury cost if there's some lead poisoning that goes on in the home and the tenant was not made aware of those precautions they should be taking while living in the home. Landlords should also have their maintenance crew trained in RRP. If you're doing work on a building that's pre-1978, you need to be trained in RRP, even if you're not doing lead abatement. If you're doing lead abatement, you should be hiring a lead abatement certified contractor with workers and supervisors, just like Trisha talked about, but even just your maintenance staff that might be replacing or repairing things so that they're aware of how to make sure to keep the property safe for the family that's living in there. Recently, a landlord that we worked with removed a shed that was covered in lead-based paint on their own, and they didn't follow RRP guidelines. So in addition to potentially facing fines for improperly removing lead, they also contaminated the entire backyard of the home, leading to an additional cost to remediate it. So my biggest recommendation to landlords would be to do it right the first time. Work with all of your licensing people, find out who's licensed, make sure your staff is licensed, make sure you're doing the disclosures, but also find people like Lead Safe Roanoke in your communities that you could participate in. That house that I showed you previously, we spent about $12,000 to $13,000 remediating the lead hazards in that home, and the landlord paid a very minimal portion of that. So here's some resources. Again, like Trisha, the EPA is a great resource. You can look up RRP certified contractors. You can find out more about RRP there. HUD, that's who we're funded through. That's their website, gives a great information about lead and some education that you might want to read up on. Another resource is Green and Healthy Homes. They're a nonprofit based out of Maryland. They have some excellent education resources on lead and healthy homes. They're also where you can find that Derek the Dinosaur coloring book is on their website. I also highly recommend that you visit our Facebook page. You can see the Lead Safe Leprechaun doing her cleaning videos, and soon we'll have a video on testing for soil outside of your home. So if you have any questions or want to learn more, feel free to visit, reach out to us. Our entire team's here to help answer any questions you might have. And then I'm going to pass it off to Zach, who's going to talk about lead inspection and abatement process that our programs do.
Great. Thank you, Katie.
All right. Well, hello. It's great to virtually be with everybody today. My name is Zach Miller. I'm with Project Homes. Let me see if I can, there we go. For those that are not familiar with Project Homes, really quickly, we are a Central Virginia-based housing nonprofit. We offer a pretty wide range of services and programs. We do critical home repairs in a number of localities, principally using CDBG funds. We build and rehabilitate affordable new single-family homes, usually in the city of Richmond. And then we have a pretty robust weatherization and utility efficiency program that kind of goes into some of the farther stretches of the service area you see there on the right. And last but not least, we originally started as a volunteer program back in the early 90s, and that program's still running strong. We've got a renew crew as well as some ramp crews who build wheelchair ramps for seniors out the region. Where I fit into all of this is that I manage our lead-based paint hazard control program. We've had a program going in Richmond, nowhere near as long as Roanoke, just a couple years now, since 2018 in partnership with the city of Richmond and the Richmond City Health District, who's a sponsor of this webinar series. We've done about 60 projects in that time period, and we were fortunate enough to get another grant and just starting our program up in Chesterfield this year. Thought I'd start today by giving a few personal examples from my life because lead really still is everywhere. You're going to learn that throughout this series. And the picture here on the left, I live in an old Victorian home in the north side of Richmond. And when I was cleaning out my garage, lo and behold, I found a thankfully empty bucket of 100% white lead linseed oil putty in the corner of the garage. And here in the middle, when I first got my license as a risk assessor and had access to that XRF analyzer, I of course took it home and played with it and tested all around my house. I found lead paint in a lot of spots where you'd expect, but I also went ahead and tested my my barware, and I'll continue. I heard that some of the historical lead poisoning theories around the Roman Empire came up on the webinar last week, so here's my Roman piece. This is a bar glass from the 70s that does have lead-based paint. And just last weekend, actually, on the right here, I was in an antique store, and this is something very common you see at antique and salvage places are, you know, old windows, doors, barn doors, things like that with chipping, peeling, lead paint. In this case, probably also the glass, I'd imagine, has lead in it as well. And it can, you know, really be hazardous when folks aren't aware of what they may be taking home from these stores. So I'll breeze through the components really quickly since Scott already touched on it. But some of our major culprits on the exterior of a home are, of course, the porches, and you name it, it can have lead, anything from the awnings, the ceilings, the floors, the railings, the columns, pretty much everything we've dealt with. And then very commonly, the overhangs around the roof line of the home, the soffits or eaves or rafters, many times look like this picture in the middle, and we have to address that. And then the siding, you also saw this on Katie's example as well. Most original lap wood siding is going to have lead-based paint on it. Many times in the city, it's already been, you know, covered up over the years by vinyl or aluminum or asbestos, but now and again we come across a home where we've got to do kind of a full treatment of the siding as well. Inside, again, baseboards, very common, and certainly of particular concern. They are at the crawling level for a young child. door casings, really any original trim in these homes, very common, much more common than you see on walls and ceilings. And then staircases as well we deal with. And so in all of this, let's not forget about the windows. Windows might be the first thing that pop into your head when you think about lead in residential old housing. You know, you've seen windows like this, I'm sure. And we are particularly concerned with taking care of these windows in our program. And the reason for that really is that these contain friction surfaces. And so we are particularly concerned with these friction surfaces. It's just like it sounds like. It's any surface that is subject to abrasion or friction. So we're talking about windows when they move up and down. We're talking about doors when they open and close, floors and stair surfaces and high traffic areas, certainly. I've got a couple examples for you there. You know, we've got the end of a door that rubs, a door jamb. As well on the right here, you can see all along this seam of this window where the paint is chipping. And the reason we're really concerned with this is because every time that surface is rubbing, it is creating that dust, which, as Katie explained, is really the number one thing we're worried about. So whatever treatments we use in our program, we pay very special attention to the friction surfaces and try to make sure we strip the lead paint off of that and reduce that friction. So as far as treatments, it's been mentioned a couple times, the interim controls on the left here, principally that's paint stabilization. We do that with probably the majority of the components we deal with, as long as the surface is actually in decent condition. This can be a good cost-effective way to deal with lead paint. And what we're doing is wet scraping. It's very important that you mist down these surfaces before you get to scraping, because that minimizes the dust again. And you're not going to be completely stripping the surface. You're just going to be scraping off anything that's loose or flaking that comes off. You want to get a good surface to work with. So from there, you're going to prime and caulk it and repaint the surface like you see below. As the name would suggest, interim, it is not permanent. So these surfaces must be monitored over time because the lead is still there underneath the paint. But again, we often see that lasting a good long time. On the right side here is the abatement. Most commonly, that's removal or replacement of components. Many times when components are severely damaged, we want to replace them rather than stabilize them. However, you also have the options for enclosure. You can enclose it behind another substrate, as you see in this example below. We put vinyl siding over some original woodlap siding in this home. There are also encapsulation, which is they sell specialized sealants and encapsulants to paint over lead paint. Those can be very cost prohibitive. We don't use them very often in Richmond. And to qualify as abatement, kind of your key criteria is that it must be designed to last at least 2 years. And so just to talk about the interplay a little bit between what we do and what Scott was describing earlier with the risk assessment. Once we qualified a client, we order a risk assessment. Someone else does the risk assessment. So we've got that in hand when we go out to the home. We know what the surfaces are with the lead hazards on them. However, it is on us to figure out the appropriate treatments to have our contractors do. And you can see 3 different situations here with ceilings. On the left, this ceiling is in good enough shape that we can probably do paint stabilization on it. In the middle, we've got a great candidate for enclosure, which is what we did. We closed it in with drywall, finished it out. And then on the right here, obviously, we're going to need to do some replacement on that ceiling to get that stabilized. Containment, don't have much time to go into the details here, but if I had one thing to say, it's plastic, and more plastic. Lots of plastics, as you can see in these pictures. The techniques really differ from situation to situation, depending on the scope of work, the weather, and what other homes and people might be nearby. And that's very important because it controls the lead dust. And at the end of the day, we have to control the lead dust in these homes. Once all of the work has been performed, we are going to order a clearance before we can have anybody come back into their home. Again, a clearance can be done by a risk assessor or a lead-based paint inspector. So once the work is performed by our lead abatement licensed contractors, they thoroughly must clean the house, not just the floors, but the windowsills, the mantles, any accessible horizontal surfaces that have not been covered by plastic. There are specialized HEPA vacuums to use for this, especially for the carpets, and specialized lead detergents as well. Sometimes, I just want to point out with the levels that we have to meet for this program, you'll run into difficult situations, maybe old wood floor that has lots of nooks and crannies in it that has not been refinished in a very long time. And sometimes we need to repaint or reseal with poly those floors to get it passing, because otherwise there's going to be dust stuck down in those surfaces. But that's usually in extreme cases. And then you can see the levels you have to meet here on the right. I'm not going to go into all those, but those the UG looking thing is microgram per square foot. Also, we've got differing soil sample levels outdoors, depending on whether it's a child's play area or not. There are some challenges with this type of program. The eligibility is a little more stringent than some of the other programs we work with at Project Homes. We're not only worried about serving qualifying people as below a certain income, but also because the program is focused on making housing lead safe for children, there must be a child under the age of 6 that either lives in or spends time at the home, or an expecting pregnant household member, for us to be able to serve them. So there's a slightly smaller pool there to make it a little challenging. We're working with federal funds, and we're dealing with a lot of things on the outside of the home, such as windows or siding, and that sort of thing. And that can really make historic approval difficult if you're in a federal historic district. Actually, here on the right is an example of some of the nice historic styled replacement windows that we use. You can notice you probably notice on the top sash here that grid pattern, the 4 different panes, is not something typical you'll see on a new window. The reason we do that, of course, is to match what was originally there, as required by the historic folks. And client relocation and preparation is a big one. Scott put it aptly earlier when he said people have a lot of stuff. This is very common in Richmond. There are logistic challenges with having a family out of the house for a certain amount of time while doing the work, but also the preparation. If there are a lot of belongings, sometimes we've got to get a storage container out to the site, sometimes even a dumpster. We ask our clients to try to move a lot of the furniture into the center of the room so they can be covered with plastic, so we can access the things like the baseboards and the windows that we need to do the work. It's a very tight construction timeline as well with this program. HUD wants us to have someone out and back into their house within 10 days if possible. And so that does not leave a lot of room for error. Sometimes if the weather does not cooperate, if material supplies do not cooperate, as we've been seeing certainly recently with coronavirus, that can push us over our timeline there. And you want to hold up your end of the bargain and get the clients back into their home as quickly as possible. And then, as I spoke about on the last slide, achieving the clearance. The dust levels are relatively stringent for this program, as they should be, but that means that sometimes it's taking us 2 or 3 days or more to get a successful clearance. So healthy homes, there's a supplemental funding that comes along with this program where you can do health-based home interventions as well. So every home, when we go in, we also do what's called a healthy homes assessment. And we've got a small amount of money we can spend in homes for some of these critical health-based needs. This is just a very small sampling of electrical hazards, fall hazards, indoor air quality. Those are some of the things that we deal with that funding in this program. And then to close us out here, to give you an idea of cost, My examples, I'm glad Scott and I were thinking along the same lines. I've got a big one here on the left and a small one on the right. And sure enough, the one on the left is a large 4-square in north side of Richmond with a wraparound porch, about 2,250 square foot, built at the turn of the century. A lot of lead in this house, very extensive interior and exterior work. Pretty much everything on the front porch. We did all the window trim. Though I do want to point out, we did not replace the windows on this home. That would have made it more expensive, of course. Pretty much all the door casings and baseboards, and a few walls and ceilings as well on this one. And for the lead work, that ran us around $20,000 on this job. You can contrast that with the home on the right here, 1-story rancher on the south side of Richmond, built almost 50 years later. And what we see is as you get into the 40s, 50s, and 60s, it's more likely that the homes aren't going to have as much lead, and when they do have lead, it is generally going to be on the exterior of the home, and that was certainly the case here. Really, most of what we did was on the front porch. There were a couple interior door casings as well, and that only ran us around $5,000 on this house. All right, and with that, I thank you and look forward to your questions. Here's my contact information as well if you'd like to get in touch.
Awesome. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Trisha. Thank you, Dwayne. Thank you, Katie. Thank you, Zach. We definitely have time for questions here. If you have questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A. We do have, one question here regarding, I don't know if anyone can answer this. How do the maps of Richmond's cases compare to the maps of Richmond's redlining maps? I'm sure a lot of you maybe have seen the New York Times article where they talked about that. Just from my knowledge, of those maps, it seems to overlay pretty perfectly. I don't know if anyone else has any other comments on that. Feel free to chime in there.
Yeah. Where's Jonathan Cannot when you need him? But yeah, I would say definitely there's a high level of correlation there. Certain neighborhoods on the south side and some neighborhoods on the north side, Barton Heights, Highland Park, and I'm pretty sure those correlate pretty well with the redlining maps.
Okay. And then this question was answered privately, but I'll put it out there for everyone else to so everyone else can see the answer as well. How does a homeowner in Richmond find out if they have a lead service line? Scott answered, if you live in the city, you can contact the Richmond Department of Public Utilities at 646-4646, and they can determine if there is a lead service line to your house. I have a question for our panel, and I was just wondering, we've talked about this process, and it seems to be very long and complex, and also kind of cost prohibitive. And I was just wondering, how that affects, these low-income families who, and even kind of the landlords, the small landlords who have small properties or things like that, that are on a tight budget. As we saw, a small home can be $5,000 to abate lead. I was just wondering if anyone could talk about the costs and how that might prevent, this important work from being done.
Well, right now, there's no reason for it not to be done because there's a HUD grant that covers the entire state. And they can access that if they were found to have a home with lead-based paint. And if they income qualify. For somebody who doesn't income qualify, well, they're going to have to dig into their pocket. And there's no way around that. But and I think Katie mentioned it, when you buy a property, you had the opportunity to determine if there was lead-based paint in that house. So you need to take that opportunity when you have it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Scott. Katie kind of touched on the education and outreach. I was wondering if you could If you have any thoughts on, are there any specific challenges or obstacles or barriers in education and outreach?
I think we're experiencing it right now. We're used to just literally Marlo will go anywhere to outreach to anyone at any event. And that's not happening right now. So we're switching to the population we're typically outreaching. We'll go to Head Starts, we go to in-person schools. None of those things are happening right now. And so figuring out how to transition our outreach, which was typically in person at large events, during this time when not what you should be doing and those events aren't happening. So I think that's been our biggest challenge. It's been pretty amazing though what some people have come up with. One of the classes that I believe the Department of Social Services does for parents, they switched to virtual and they were able to get us back in on the rotation once they kind of figured out all of that. And so we're still able to do our presentation just virtually. But I think there's a big difference between asking someone to come in their home to do lead testing, ask them to leave their home for strangers that they've only met a couple of times. And so we do miss out a lot on that in-person interaction from our outreach. So that's why it's really important on those first interactions that we have with people to be really respectful of being in their home and kind of understand their fears of what it might be to let somebody else in their home and have them leave for a long time.
Thank you. This question may be for Dwayne, but might be open for everyone. Since the Flint water crisis, have you seen an increased awareness or concern on the part of renters and homeowners about the issue of lead?
Yes, this is Dwayne, and the short answer is yes. So after the Flint, Michigan crisis, we've also had some issues pop up in some other cities across the country. Part of the reason that we're getting the lead and copper rule revisions that I had talked about in my presentation, that develops from those issues, especially from Flint, Michigan. And so we get a lot of questions around that and water quality generally. And one of the things, I didn't put it in my presentation, but there's a drinking water watch link on our Virginia Department of Health webpage where you can go, and I had mentioned that there were 2,830 public water systems in Virginia. You can go to the community water systems, the ones that are subject to the lead and copper rule, and you can look and see what the lead results are from the sampling at your public water system. And so we get a lot of requests for information about what's in my water, and we help with that. And then there's a consumer confidence report that the public water systems generate, and that goes out to the public. You may have seen it if you're connected to a public water supply, and that describes the risks and what the public water system is doing to treat the water and the types of things that they're doing to try and make sure that your water is safe when you drink it.
Thank you. Katie, Donna had this question for you. How receptive are your landlords towards the HUD grant assistance, and how receptive are tenants going through the application process?
I think it really varies depending on the landlord and the tenant and kind of who's driving the process. We've had the best luck when there's kind of already a relationship between the tenant and landlord. I think that's just easier. They've developed a relationship. But for the most part, pretty well, as long once we get that application in and the landlord realizes that we will do thousands of dollars worth of work on their properties, and the only cost that we ask for our landlords help us relocate the family costs. So that's not when you're thinking about potentially having $10,000 to $20,000 worth of work on your property. Relocating somebody for up to 10 days is minimal compared to that. And we have some landlords that we work with frequently. They recognize that a child's living in the home and they will send them right over to us. Obviously, there's always some struggles back and forth with getting paperwork and all of that kind of stuff and coordinating. We do require landlords to keep that family in the unit. And if for some reason the family chooses to leave, the landlord has signed documentation that they will rent actively attempt to rent that unit back out to a family that meet our income guidelines and have children living in the home.
Great.
It's helping increase the stock of lead-safe rental units in the city.
I think we have time for one more question, and this one's mine, selfishly, I guess. Or what would you want to see done at the federal or state level to really increase the amount of lead remediation done? It's open to anyone.
Somebody said it in the chat because they responded to what I said about you may have to dig into your pocket. Everybody can't dig into your pocket, but it's more resources for people who need those resources
Mhm.
to fix a house given their living situation. And the other thing is for landlords, more enforcement and deeper penalties.
Yeah, and I would say if there were some resources out there that weren't as restrictive, because again, sometimes you run into families where they're right over the income limit, or even more often, they don't have a child under 6. They've got a 6-year-old, a 7-year-old, an 8-year-old. Unfortunate as it is in certain situations with our program, if you've got a child who's lead poisoned, but they're 8 years old, sorry, the line with HUD is very black and white. You have to have a child under the age of 6. And our goal overall is to make the housing stock lead safe. So, whoever lives in that house is going to change over the years. We want to just take care of it.
Great. I guess we'll answer this one last question. Are there any low to no cost basic lead certification class available for new housing specialists? I don't know if Trisha, you might know that answer.
I need to be more specific as to RRP or lead risk assessor.
Probably RRP, right? I mean, that's kind of the intro course, but I don't know. Katie might know more about somebody else might know more about the cost on that training, but
I think as a housing specialist, I'm not 100% sure, but that means that you're going into other people's homes and kind of want to have an idea about what to look for when you're in there. I think just doing the education that this presentation showed would be enough as identifying, hey, there might be some concerns here, and reaching out to some resources. RRP is a good one. If you live in Roanoke, feel free to send me an email and I'll get you a class.
Trisha, did you have something?
No, I think Katie gave the best answer because we don't keep information for the lead abatement training providers in terms of their pricing, since that's a business function. So I will defer to Katie's answer.
All right.
also they're heavy courses. Anybody who's sat through one of those, that's not for the faint of, if you're not planning on going out and inspecting lots of homes for lead and doing risk assessments, I would not recommend, you see Trisha nodding and laughing over there, I would not recommend going through the week-long risk assessment, cost aside.
Well, we're come to the end here. I'd like to thank all our panelists here. Definitely tune in next week. We're going to talk about the legal landscape of lead hazard control. And then that's happening next Wednesday, same time. And then the Wednesday after that, September 9th, is going to be our final session. We're going to close out. We're going to talk about national best practices. As you exit this webinar, you will be redirected to a survey. We'd love to hear some feedback from you, just how beneficial these webinars have been to you, and please give us your feedback and any comments. And with that, I'd like to say good afternoon to all of you. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Eric.
Thank you all.